Now we take a look at the camera exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is something that makes difference between you being an amateur and you being a professional. Understanding what the camera is doing in auto and essentially being able to make that in manual. This is the first step in doing any sort of camera exercise. So the triangle really is based on three different things. The first one is aperture or iris. So we have to control the iris. Remember, the iris is how big or wide the diameter of the iris or the aperture is inside the camera. Remember when it is that it's inverse. So when you have something like f2, that's like wide open. So iPhones are usually set to those cameras are 2.2. And then the more closed it is, it becomes more like f22. So the darker your image is or the brighter it is outside and you need to control for that, your f-stops need to be in that higher range. So that's one of the first things that we look at when doing the exposure triangle. The second thing that we have to look at is shutter speed. Shutter speed, of course, is how fast the shutter is moving. It is the literal shutter that's underneath. Now, of course, you know, in film days, this was how long it would expose the film to, right? How much would light actually penetrate onto the film? Now, what we're doing is the image sensor. So how long is the image sensor being exposed to light? And so it's literally a gate that just goes like this, right? And what it does is stops and opens. And that's written out as a fraction. So when we're doing television things, mainly what we're looking at is 1/60, right? Because it's easy to do 1/60 because we're usually doing, 30 frames per second. So you just double it, right? So those are the first two elements that we generally use. Now, of course, in the studio, all these things were pretty much controlled for you. So moving on the field, you have to start making these decisions because they all affect each other. I can open my iris really wide and then I can bring down my shutter to compensate for that extra light, or vice versa. I can close my iris down, but that means I have to really balance out my shutter speed on top of that. So it's always this kind of give and take. And on top of those two things, which are the main things that we deal with, we have the third part. And the third part is ISO, or gain. And this is really how sensitive the image sensor is going to be to light. Now, on this camera, the JVC, it's pretty simple. There's a low, a medium, and a high gain. It's measured in decibels. In this camera, it's listed as 0 as low, 9 as medium, and 18 as high. Now, the problem with shooting in this is that a lot of people try to use gain as opposed to trying to use light. Usually when you need to put in gain, that means you need to add light. The problem with gain on its own is that it adds graininess to your picture. It degrades the quality of your picture. And so it's much better to find more light if you're really having to boost that gain. However, if you're shooting in news or in another format where it's kind of on-the-go shooting, then that is where you're going to probably need gain, especially if you're shooting a house fire or a crime scene at night, where you're probably not going to be able to have lights. So those are the three elements that we look at when we're doing shutter, iris, and gain.